We talked a lot about the role of elected politics and participatory democracy. We also talked about the kind of interplay between practice and thinking and doing. And I think our next speaker, Lex Paulson, from Director of International Projects at D21, who's a professor, a thinker, a doer, has lots of experience. And I think he's going to give us a really good overview of the interesting work he's done with political campaigning and how that links to participation, decision-making, and democracy. So Lex, please.
Thanks. So what I want to share with you today, so first of all, thank you for this introduction, and to Cesar for this wonderful conference. I think we're practicing what we preach here with the amount of exchange and interaction, so thank you for inviting this strange American to come and be a part of it. So I want to share with you two stories in the next few minutes. They're stories that are hopeful. They're stories about innovation. They're stories that brought a lot of joy to a lot of people, but also disappointment, and about the wisdom that we hopefully can find in disappointment. There are two villains in these stories about democratic innovation. The first villain is an external opponent, an external enemy. And these are the structural barriers that we see to the change that we want. The inertia of institutions, the tenacity of the old ways of doing business, sometimes the venality of special interests who are trying to protect themselves. That's the external barrier. We know those are difficult to change. But there are also internal ones, and those are sometimes the ones that are tougher to see. And these are, in some cases, the most consequential on whether or not democratic change happens, whether we can transform our own abilities from passive observers to active participants, whether we can overcome our own ability sometimes to translate a political moment into lasting change. So I had the chance to live through two very exciting elections. You'll notice what you don't see in these pictures. What you don't see in these pictures are the candidates, the men who became heads of state in the US and in France. And this is because what I want to argue to you is that in a very real sense, it was the movements and not the men who won these two elections. Now, I've only met Barack Obama, Emmanuel Macron, a small handful of times. Basically, I don't know them any better than you know them. But I know their movements very well. And I want to tell you what it was like to be one of the few people to have been a part of both of them. I want to also draw your attention to a paradox, what I think may be one of the toughest paradoxes of our work in democratic innovation, of trying to fix the way democracies work day to day. So my belief, which has been reinforced from what I've heard from some of you today, is that, of course, central to our mission is about giving power back to people who feel excluded. Expanding the circles of people who are exerting control over decisions. But what's paradoxical is to accomplish that, very often we need strong leaders. We need political will. We need people at the top of the ticket who can win a mandate for change and who can focus their will not on consolidating power, but on sharing power. And that's rare. Not all politicians are like that. And behind this, of course, we need a leader able to build a movement of structural change, with a theory of change, a theory of how change happens. And a willingness to change the very system that brought them their power. In a sense, to make these changes at their own expense, at expense of the system that rewarded them with votes. So in each of kind of the stories I want to tell, I want us to think about the relationship between the political will, the political leaders, the movements that deliver this change on the ground, and how that can translate into deep structural institutional change. Because institutions are the hardest. It's much easier to win an election than to change an institution. So, I think these are happy stories, ultimately. And I've reveled in these successes of these campaigns that restored hope, that changed laws. In some cases, I want to argue, in the case of the Obama victory, that succeeded in saving lives. I think there are people who are alive today, notably because of our healthcare reform, that might not have been had we not won this election. So there were serious successes, but there were also failures. We have to be honest and say that we didn't achieve, in the Obama campaign anyway, after 8 years, we did not achieve the political change that we wanted. And we're living today in 2018 with the results of that. But I maintain that the failures of these two movements may be more instructive to us than their successes. And in fact, that in the seeds of their successes also are the strategies that can help us overcome those failures. So what was it like to be a part of Barack Obama's campaign for president? Well, it wasn't like this every day, right? This is probably what you saw if you were watching this from Sweden or from Portugal or from other places around the world. A very attractive, eloquent, exciting young candidate giving powerful speeches in front of adoring crowds. Maybe you would see the music videos with will.i.am and the Black Eyed Peas, right? That was the easiest thing to see if you were not living as part of the campaign. But this was not the experience of the Barack Obama campaign for the thousands of us who worked inside of it. If you want to know what it really felt like to help build the Obama movement, you need to know who this is. Does anyone know who this is? No. Okay. This is Professor Marshall Gans. He teaches at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is the exponent, maybe the best known exponent of tradition we call community organizing in America. And he was the chief organizing strategist of Barack Obama's campaign. And he's had a great influence on my life. He was the man who trained me as well in my first experience in presidential politics. So what is community organizing? Now I have to tell you at least a very short version of the history of what it means when I say community organizing. Community organizing as a tradition in the US began in the 1930s in a very poor neighborhood in Chicago called Back of the Yards. And it came out of a series of traditions from what we call the progressive era. So there had been efforts to organize workers, organize women for the right to vote. All of these movements were important precursors to community organizing. But what was innovative was the way in which this man, Saul Alinsky, on the top left here, who was a young philosophy student, actually, and labor organizer in Chicago, he created an organization called the Industrial Areas Foundation. And its pilot was in this place called Back of the Yards. And what was innovative about it was that instead of thinking about social problems as either we need to have a national law to fix this, right, or we need to deal with individual people like charity cases, what Saul Alinsky said is we actually need to think about community-level power. So he was a labor organizer. He understood that to take power in a factory, you needed to get people to think collectively and build a collective sense of purpose. But he applied that tradition to the level of the neighborhood and said, if we're going to solve these problems, and now he's coming out of a progressive intellectual tradition, we need to live them. We need to experience them. We need to find solutions from the bottom up and not from the top down. This was a very influential way of organizing, so much so that by the 1950s, it had spread to California. Two young organizers named Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. How many of you have heard of Cesar Chavez? A couple. Good. That's a solid handful. Cesar Chavez is a very important civil rights leader in the US. Some have called him the Martin Luther King of the Latino community in the US. And what did he do? He went into one of the most kind of underserved, impoverished communities in the US, which were migrant farm workers from Mexico. This is during the 40s and 50s when we lost a lot of the labor in the Second World War, and so a lot of Mexican workers came up and were picking avocados in the fields and grapes and these things. And they were treated horribly. There was no sense of responsibility to give them a clean, healthy workplace, or give them rest, or give them health care, or give them workers' compensation for getting injured. They were completely vulnerable and completely unlistened to, without any power. And Cesar Chavez, building on this tradition from Saul Alinsky in Chicago, organized house meetings of workers to share stories, to say, how do we understand how my individual story relates to everybody else's story in this field, and what can we do to alter the conditions, the concrete conditions that have affected us, that have made our lives worse. And through his organizing efforts with the United Farm Workers in the 1960s and 70s, he won the first ever collective bargaining agreement for migrant farm workers. Basic things like the right to water, clean water, the right to rest periods, the right to toilets, and also more broad things like the right to health insurance. He had the first workers' cooperative health care. So there were some very important victories, and one of Cesar Chavez's young assistants on these campaigns was Marshall Gans, the man who trained me and the man who organized the campaign of Barack Obama. So the key principles to understand why this is different from maybe other kinds of campaigns or traditions. So the principles of community organizing that Marshall Gans taught to me and to my fellow organizers was, first, you begin by listening very, very hard to understand what is the interest of each member of this community. Why are they motivated to act? What is their kind of emotional response to the questions of the day? And second, this is maybe the most important law, is that the role of an organizer is not to become the spokesperson. It's not to become the leader, right? It's to become the enabler, the facilitator, to help people in the community who feel very excluded and very marginalized build their own power, find their own voices, organize together to take concrete actions to make people in power redress problems and make the changes that will help their lives. And finally, we don't fear uncertainty as organizers, says Marshall Gans. We embrace it. Why? It's because uncertainty in democracy is what gives us our power. The fact that the future is not written. There isn't a technical answer to every problem. That it's the uncertainty that requires us to act and make choices. And in those choices, we are constantly learning. We're constantly adjusting. And so there's no one plan. There's no one textbook. We have to constantly learn. And the great tool that he gives us, that this tradition creates, is the skill that we use every day as organizers, is what Gans calls public narrative. Why? Because, what he says, knowledge and data, giving people knowledge, giving people facts, yes, we can influence their beliefs, but if you want to motivate someone to act, you need emotions, you need values. And stories are vectors for values. Stories are how we embody and incarnate values. And this is the goal of narrative, is to, through our stories, create motivation to take action, to take risks, to build a team, and to engage. And he says that there are three key stories that make up the art of public narrative. There's a story of self. What have I lived through? Who has inspired me? What's given me faith to overcome obstacles? What do I want for my life and for my family? There's a story of self. There's a story also of us, which is, once I've heard all these stories, once we've heard each other's stories, what is our collective story as a community? How do we get here? What is the texture that makes us different from other towns, from other neighborhoods? What do we love? What do we fear? And then finally, the story of now. What Marshall Gans says, what is the difference between the world that we envision and the world that we see today? That gap is what creates our motivation to act. Difference between the actual and the possible. And what choice do we have to make today, and what sacrifice will we have to make in order to bring about the world that we imagine? And all of these stories follow a basic pattern. Giving facts, giving a list of facts is not telling a story, Marshall Gans said. If you want to motivate someone to act, a story has a simple architecture, a challenge, something unexpected happens to you, right? If I say, hey, I woke up this morning, I walked down from my hotel room and I came here to this ballroom. Did I tell you a story? No, it's a stupid story, right? If I say, I woke up this morning, I came down and the door to the ballroom was locked and there were police cars all outside the hotel, Right? Now there's something interesting, something unexpected, right? I'm forced to choose. What do? Do I go to the police? Do I run outside? Right? And the choice that I make in this story brings about an outcome, brings about a result, a moral, a lesson. Right? That's the architecture of a story. This is how we create meaning through stories. And in 1983, a young Columbia graduate who had grown up in Hawaii and Indonesia, of parents from Kenya and Kansas, comes from New York City to Chicago. And he gets hired by a local NGO called the Developing Communities Foundation. And Barack Obama was trained in these methods to build communities door to door, house meeting to house meeting, campaign to campaign. And when he said campaign, it's not electoral campaign. It's not a campaign to elect somebody. It's a campaign to make a change. A campaign to get rid of the asbestos in a building. A campaign to clean up the trash in a public park. These are the kind of campaigns that organizers are meant to focus on. And so when Obama built his presidential campaign, the biggest campaign, the biggest grassroots campaign in the history of our country, this was what was central. So yes, you needed the rallies, you needed the captivating images to get people interested. We used technology, right? This is a very innovative website in 2008, which now looks pretty clunky and outdated, but in 2008 it was rather innovative. And it offered all kinds of tools. The website was not about, look how great Barack Obama is. It's, give us your postcode, we'll tell you what's happening near you. If you're an organizer, you can volunteer. You can download a list of voters to call. You can create your own event and invite other people in your neighborhood to come. Right? So it was all about giving tools to people through the technology to engage in the way they wanted to engage in the campaign. And so in some ways, this campaign did have to follow some of the traditional important structure. You know, we had to be able to target our votes. I was living in Connecticut, a blue state meaning heavily Democratic state, very much in the Northeast there. So my job wasn't to try to win Connecticut, it was to try to organize people to make phone calls and to make visits to the other states that were more contested, places like Pennsylvania, which we lost in 2016, and places like New Hampshire. So we had to follow a kind of a conventional political structure in some ways. We had to spend our resources wisely. We weren't just operating in an amoeba, but the basis for how we did this work were community organizing. That was how we thought of ourselves, and that was how we campaigned. And this was new in American politics, right? If you think about how campaigns are usually organized, it's a model looks like this. It's a hierarchy, it's a pyramid. You have a candidate who sets the direction, who has his senior staff underneath, junior staffers underneath that, and then all your volunteers. This is still how most campaigns are organized. And what's the role of volunteers? These are the majority of people on your campaign. What do? Well, they're there to pass out flyers. They're there to come to your rallies and wave signs, right? But are they really contributing their ideas? Are they contributing their expertise and their intelligence? Not usually. So Obama said, no, we're going to do this differently. We're going, instead of making the candidate and his team the center of the apex of a pyramid, we're going to think of ourselves as facilitators of local organizing committees. We're going to get people to think of themselves as central. Stefania, who was in my previous workshop, Stefania, you here somewhere? Yeah. Gave a great, also nice analogy of concentric circles in Bologna, where she works. The idea of you want to start by motivating people in a closely knit community, and then they get their friends, and they get their friends, and this is how you build out. This is the organizing model also that we tried to use and to build on. And what this meant was that all different kinds of people were coming together, being given tools and given responsibility that no politician had ever given them before. And through this tactic of the house meeting, you were sharing stories. And where I lived in Connecticut, there were rich towns right next to very poor cities. And oftentimes in these stories, you would hear people talking about their fears for their kids, or talking about the fact that their husband, who lost his job on Wall Street, couldn't get a surgery. And the problems about health insurance, problems about education, these were problems that brought people together, that people in African American communities and wealthier communities could find common ground and create a story of us. And finally, a story of now. What was on the agenda for 2008? What do we have to do to change the country? During this campaign, I first encountered the term collective intelligence. Who here has read a book by this man, James Surowiecki, called The Wisdom of Crowds? Some people, a couple people. A very enthusiastic hand in the back, so I think you must have liked it. So James Surowiecki, who's an economist who writes, an economic journalist, I should say, writes for The New Yorker. He says that collective intelligence, the way that a crowd of people in this room, how could we make a better decision together than an individual expert? What are the 4 things you need? And he says, well, the first thing you need is you need some kind of decentralization. If we all have the same base of knowledge, we're not going to make a good decision. Right? What makes us more intelligent than any single one of us is that you come from one town, you come from a different town, and we're all bringing different points of view. Second is diversity. That to be intelligent, even 2 people from the same town need to think differently. Right? Diversity is about how you analyze a problem. And so 2 people who are in the same household, as you know, brothers and sisters don't always agree, and they're from the same place. So it's diversity of thinking in addition to decentralized experience. Third is independence. This means that when people are in a room together, there's not a herd effect where an influential person influences everybody else to agree with them. Independence means that people within a group feel empowered to speak their mind honestly and to disagree. And finally, aggregation. For a crowd to be intelligent, there needs to be a way of, a structured way of pooling resources together, your collective experience into a final decision, right? We saw, for example, Occupy Wall Street, right? Occupy Wall Street and the Occupy movement, very decentralized, very diverse, pretty diverse, certainly independent, like people were making up their own minds, but how well was it aggregated? How well did it meet a collective set of clear goals, right? So this is the challenge. And we all think about this in our organizations. We all have reason to think about it. Last little thing I'll say about the Obama campaign was the way we use technology. And I think this has a direct relevance to our work in participation. Sometimes we think that a great tool, we can bring it in and it's going to solve our problems. Look at this beautiful app. We have this app, all of a sudden we're going to crowdsource. The crowdsourcing, it's going to be magic. Look at all these great things we're going to have, right? What we figured out in the Obama campaign was that technology will never substitute for a good in-person interaction. That you have to have high-quality, in-person movement building for technology to then help you. And what technology can do then is, it can help you coordinate. It can help you invite your friends to things. It can help you get tools from a central place. So Chicago would send us voter lists or give us tools to do GPS mapping to plan our door knocking so we're using our time most efficiently. It's great for sharing. It's great for coordinating. It's not good for mobilizing people who don't want to be mobilized. So this is one of the major lessons from the Obama campaign. The second is, how do you do a call to action? So, we use a Twitter account. Twitter was pretty new. This was in 2012, actually, but it makes the point that every time that we're putting out information, we're also asking for a specific action. Not just click here and like this petition, but will you join this event? We have a national day of action. Will you step up and host an event? So this is a very typical way in which the Obama movement would connect online information, online communication, with very specific offline, in-person ways of helping. To make that link between the online and the in-person as short, rapid, simple as possible. And in this goal, we succeeded. The day after the election, President-elect Obama got on the phone with all of the organizers, and I got to listen to the conference call, and he said, what truly amazes me is that we've managed to build in this campaign perhaps the most effective political organization currently in American politics. And I know for a fact that a lot of you aren't even old enough to drink, right? I mean, the amount of effort and energy and creativity that went in this campaign, it only would have been possible because these people were valorized, because people were recognized for their efforts. They weren't just given a handful of flyers and say, go pass out flyers. They were made part of these local committees. They were asked about their stories. They were given tools and training to go out and knock on doors. And so, of course, they were willing to. And we were able to take it to scale. We were able to aggregate it. There are 40% of all the households in the US, about 48 million households, got a direct visit from an Obama volunteer. In the swing states, in the key states, that was 2/3. So if you lived in Florida or Ohio, there was 2 out of 3 chance that me or another Obama volunteer physically came to where you lived and knocked on your door. And in a lot of cases, we did it more than once to get people to vote. That's only possible when you have the right method, when you have the right method at small scale that allows you to attract people, recognize them, train them, get them to bring others in. So what happened? Why are we here in 2018 with the America and the democracy that we all deplore? I imagine there aren't a lot of Trump fans in this room here in Stockholm. Maybe there are. I'm certainly not one. Well, we had the leadership. We had his theory of change. Obama's theory of change, though, was that we could make politics better by communicating better, by listening better, by finding common ground. He really believes that democracy can overcome tribal differences, racial differences, religious differences by truly listening and collaborating. This was an enormous amount of faith that he put in political actors, and we saw very quickly after he became president that the Republican Party said, no, we're not making compromises. We don't want any health care reform. We don't want to spend any money on the stimulus, right? Do it yourself. You know, Mitch McConnell, who's currently the leader of the Senate, said, my number one goal for the next 2 years is to make Obama a one-term president. So our theory of change didn't really hold up in the face of what the opposition party was willing to do. The other problem, though, is about our movement. So our campaign had 2 million active volunteers, 2 million people who had done at least one volunteer action by the end of the campaign. This movement, these were not all Democrats, but the choice was, well, do we try to invite these people to join the Democratic Party, or do we do something else? Well, what we did was found this new organization called Organizing for America that became part of the Democratic Party. And instead of letting people create their own campaigns on the ground, OFA, Organizing for America, made calls to action about Congress. Pressure Congress to pass the health care bill, pressure Congress to pass a climate change bill. Now, these were all good laws that needed support, but we'd gone from a system where people were being asked for their own creativity and to come up with their own ideas to a system where, you know, call your congressman and we'll send you a bumper sticker. And so, within a year, we lost 80% of the active members of Barack Obama's movement within 1 year. But you know who learned from us? The Republicans. And the Tea Party organized a very strong grassroots movement, 2009, to oppose health care, and 2010, to take back Congress. They took back Congress, and they're still there. Lessons to be learned. Flash forward to 2017. What am I doing here, standing in the 18th arrondissement of Paris, leading a Obama-style door-to-door training in Paris? Well, I moved to Europe after this Tea Party election to start a PhD. I met this man, Carl, who is a mathematician and anti-corruption activist and the inventor of this voting system called D21, where people make decisions with multiple plus and minus votes, subject for another time. And I was happy enough to meet Giovanni, who knows so many people in this room. Hi, Gio. And this is the three of us in Tunisia at the World Social Forum. And thanks to people like Giovanni and Josh Lerner, who's maybe here somewhere also, I started learning about participatory budgeting and other ways of innovating between elections that don't involve electing leaders, that involve changing the way citizens and governments collaborate. So thank you, Giovanni, for changing the course of my professional life. We, D21, then worked with Josh's team in New York to propose the first online voting solution for participatory budgeting in New York City, which 40,000 people have just voted in a couple weeks ago. We introduced PB in the Czech Republic, where now we work with 13 municipalities, including districts of Prague. First time in the history of that country. And I live in Paris. We have a team based in France, and we're doing all different kinds of participatory processes, urbanism, et cetera. February 2017 of last year, I was invited to a local get-together and watched this speech. I've been following Emmanuel Macron, but not terribly closely. I was very interested in his independent candidacy, but I didn't know much about him. And he said, "Je veux ce soir lancer un appel solennel. I want to give a call tonight of all researchers who, in the United States, fight against obscurantism, fight against people who want to pull the facts away. You have today, and you will have from this May, a new terre patrie, a new homeland, and that will be France." And I thought, this man is speaking to me. And I realized that there are a lot of his qualities that I recognized from my experience with Barack Obama. A willingness to rethink traditional political divides, a willingness to give power away, decentralize power within his movement. But of course, En Marche was not the Democratic Party or the Obama campaign. Obama had been an elected US senator. He had worked with the Democratic Party for decades. Emmanuel Macron was starting something completely new that didn't exist before. So when I was invited to his campaign headquarters and I sat with his team and they were excited that someone with some political experience from the US was maybe going to help out. And I said, okay, well, here's how we would do a door-to-door campaign. We would, every time we meet a voter, we code them from 1 to 5, depending on their favorability. And then we go back to the 3s who are wavering. And then I said, we can't do that. This is France. Like, we're not allowed to hold data on people. We have these privacy laws. You can't do American-style things in France. So I said, okay, let's iterate. Let's try something new. Let's try this door-to-door effort and see what happens. Well, fortunately, En Marche had already started doing a door-to-door exercise. They did this thing called La Grande Marche, the Great March, in the previous summer, which was a diagnostic exercise actually facilitated by some French guys who had been volunteers for Barack Obama, and so who were learning about door-to-door already. So already some of this Obama energy was coming into Emmanuel Macron's campaign. And so I said, well, great. So why don't we propose a way of modifying this door-to-door method for your campaign? And then something even more exciting was that En Marche, unlike the Obama campaign, was really trying to crowdsource the creation of its policy program. So Barack Obama believed in his grassroots, but he was not asking 100,000 people what his opinion on healthcare should be, right? Emmanuel Macron was, to some degree, putting some very key policy decisions into the hands of his movement. Not entirely. It was balanced with expert advisors and his own personal opinions. But he was conducting what he called ateliers d'intelligence collective, collective intelligence workshops in the fall and winter. So by the time I arrived in the campaign in January, February, there was already this idea that we believe in participation. Our theory of change is not just about winning the election. Our theory of change is about changing how citizens are included in government. And that was very exciting to me. And I thought that it was even a step beyond what Barack Obama had proposed in his campaign. So I worked with his team and created this sort of guide to going door to door. What do you do? What do you say first? You don't say, "Hi, I'm a representative of Emmanuel Macron." You start with your prénom. You start with your first name. You say, "I'm a neighbor," or "I'm from nearby. We're here to ask if people are going to vote in the elections." And then you open a conversation. You say, "Are you thinking about voting?" You don't say, "Do you have 5 minutes to talk about politics?" People say, "No." You say, "Are you planning on voting this year?" And then no matter what they say, "Yes, I am." "Have you made up your mind yet? Are you still thinking?" Or if they say, "No, I'm not." "Why? Are you frustrated?" "I'm frustrated too." Or maybe I'm not sure yet. "Oh, really?" And whatever their answer is, you're opening a conversation. So I proposed sort of a way of structuring these conversations to have something meaningful, a dialogue, even a mini sort of sharing of stories from 5 to 10 minutes at each door. And they sent me around different parts of France to train local communities. I did about 50, 60 different trainings, trained about 2,000 people. And this was not as big a scale as the Obama campaign. We didn't reach 40% of the households, but we activated 25,000 people to go door to door, which in France had never happened before. Door to door had started in a kind of a superficial way under the campaign of François Hollande in 2012. That was the first time it had been tried in a major party election. And so we were doing something new. And it was very exciting and, of course, it paid off. Now you will say, oh, well, Macron, he had Le Pen in front of him, he was going to win anyway, or it was the Fillon scandal. Yes, these things were factors. But if you look at Emmanuel Macron, if you look at how he did in the first and second round of the election versus the polls, which in France were very accurate, these public polls before the election were very accurate, the only candidate that overperformed his rating in the final polls was Emmanuel Macron, right? From about 1 to 1.5%, right? And that 1 to 1.5% are the people mobilized on the ground. And in an election where the top 4 candidates are between 19 and 24%, 1.5% can matter a lot. So I give a lot of credit to our volunteers on the ground who were going door to door in France in the fact that Emmanuel Macron was able to win the first round and in the second round against Marine Le Pen, and then finally to win a majority of seats in which of his candidates in En Marche, 50% were men, 50% were women. 95% had never run for parliament before and needed a lot of help in structuring their campaigns, so I was on the ground a lot in June. And then even more exciting, after we won the presidency and the parliament, the party said, we want to try some new ways that a party, they didn't want to call themselves a party, we're a movement, how this movement can reform and reinvent politics. And so this is me at the National Convention last summer in Paris, announcing the creation of a community organizing program, the first one ever sponsored by a major party in France, which is still in its pilot phase right now. We don't know what will become of the Macron movement. Already we're seeing some signs of tension. That on the one hand, you had this movement built on the participation culture and in collective intelligence, with lots of public consultations where tens of thousands of people are giving their opinions. On the other hand, we have a president in a hurry. Presidents in a hurry don't have a lot of time to listen. And so there's tension there. There's some frustration. There's some fatigue. People don't want to do politics 24 hours a day. So we'll see. I think what's exciting now is that we created, in the lead up to the European elections, a way for marcheurs, people not only in France but across Europe, to get involved in what we call the Grande Marche pour l'Europe. Has anyone here heard of the Grande Marche pour l'Europe? A couple people? No? Okay, I'm telling you for the first time, that's fine. Clearly we have some communications work to do. And the idea is to go door to door, not just to people who already like Europe, but people who are skeptical, and just to listen. The Grande Marche is not a persuasion campaign. The Grande Marche is a listening campaign to understand why people who are frustrated with Europe and the EU, why they're frustrated, why they perceive things the way they do. And it's very hard. When you're pro-European, it's hard to just sit there and listen to someone who is maybe misinformed or yelling about all the evil immigrants. But this is a sincere conviction because we think we cannot persuade people to support a European project if we haven't listened first, if we haven't really understood. And this goes back again to the community organizing tradition, right? You cannot create change if you don't listen first to understand what is motivating people and their own perception of their interest. So, in conclusion, I want to share just 3 lessons for what I have learned. So, the first is collective intelligence can thrive when the goal is very clear. I think we can all agree that movements are easier to build when you're trying to win an election than when you're trying to change local government and how day-to-day difficult government can work. Now, giving due credit to the personal talents and abilities of the candidates themselves, I want to say that the Obama and Macron movements succeeded because they were collectively more intelligent than their opponents. And they were more intelligent because each of these men made the decision to decentralize power, not to keep power, but to decentralize it and to listen and to give authority and autonomy to the grassroots of their campaigns. But this decentralization was made possible because people from all these walks of life who came to volunteer, who had never done politics before, there was a clear goal. There's going to be an election on November 2nd, on April 23rd. The candidate who gets more votes will become the head of state. Clear, tangible, time limited. Right? This is the benefit that we had that the Occupy movement or the Me Too movement struggle with. Can you identify goals that help the 99%? Yes, but it's much harder to do that. So that's the first challenge. How do you identify goals that are clear, tangible, time limited in the way that an election can be? Second is about the way we use digital technology in democratic innovation. So I want to say this again. Digital tools should be enablers and amplifiers, but not substitutes. Why? Because our power to make change doesn't come from the number of Twitter followers we have. It doesn't come from the number of people we can send a mass email to, or how fast we can do it. It comes from the quality of our relationships, the strong ties, the people who would lie down in traffic for you, who would wake up at 6 a.m. on a Saturday to drive to Pennsylvania to go knock on doors and get doors slammed in their faces. That's how you prove the power of a movement. And which is why every time that I work with my team at D21 to design a process, think about how we design a participatory process, I think about Marshall Gans. I think about Barack Obama's organizing guru. I think about public narrative, because it's by sharing these stories that we build trust, by transforming our own individual experiences that we have in our bubble into a shared sense of purpose. And this doesn't mean that we stop innovating technologically. On the contrary, we're learning all the time from cognitive science about psychology, about our biases, about our shortcuts, about, there are all kinds of new innovations that are coming. But I think that it is these types of innovations and data visualization and the way we use creative art in telling our stories, that these are things we should be putting our attention to as much or more as the next great policy app. Finally, to achieve lasting structural change, we have to understand political timing and make it work in our favor. I study the history of democracy. Maybe you've studied 5th century Athens. Well, how did democracy get going in 5th century Athens? Well, the Persians invaded. The poor people of Athens were said, get in the boats. We need to row these boats and win the Battle of Salamis. And then after the war was over and the Greeks had won, Pericles and Ephialtes said, we're not going to ignore these people who fought and died and bled in this war. We have to give them real power. And so the transition to a full democracy in Athens, not in our sense, obviously, but a full democracy in the sense of poor people and rich people making decisions equally on an equal footing, was realized because of that political moment, the political opportunity. The US Constitution, a radical document, a radical reframing of power, was only possible because of an economic crisis in the 1780s that said, we have this existing Articles of Confederation, we're going to throw it out. We got to start over again, right? It was the political moment. Fifth Republic in France. Fifth Republic would not have been possible without the crisis in Algeria, and so on and so on. And I think one of the most important things that links Emmanuel Macron with Barack Obama was their ability to sense political opportunity, the right moment, the kairos, as the Greeks would say, when others told them to wait, when others told them you shouldn't run, you're too young, you're not ready, well, let someone else do it. And they said, no, this is the right moment. I don't think it's an accident that they're both scholars, they've both thought deeply about history, and they know that political history doesn't repeat itself, but history can rhyme. This is why we read history, to understand what opportunity looks like so we're able to take it. Now, we have to be clear and realistic about the failures. Obama won the election, he saved the US economy, arguably, and helped 20 million Americans get health care. But he missed the chance to do more structural reforms. He missed the chance to fix congressional rules, to fix our political redistricting process, campaign finance reform. These were things that were not addressed and that have allowed the Republicans, and now Donald Trump, to take consolidated control of our government. I think Emmanuel Macron has a deeper commitment to structural reform, both in France and at the EU level, but I think it will only succeed if he is able to successfully include people and make these processes legitimate, participatory, inclusive. If it's just another technocratic fix, Europe loses and the populists win. So I think participation and inclusion are what will decide the success of Emmanuel Macron's term as president. So finally, we in this room, we're experimenters. We're technicians, we're researchers, we're experts in our fields. But we're also actors in history. We're actors in politics. We shouldn't be afraid of politics, even when it frustrates us, even when it disgusts us. To change democracy for the better, we must understand power, how it's won, how it can be responsibly used. So I look forward to building the next great movement and the next great democratic story with all of you. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Lex. we've only got a couple of minutes, but that was an incredibly inspiring and thought-provoking presentation, because I was sort of listing lots of new ideas and thoughts, and actually inspiring, but also very challenging, because a lot of the things you listed as being important are also very sort of run counter to how local government operates. The idea of the local government as a storyteller, or local government as a facilitator rather than the kind of deliverer. And you kind of used the nice picture of the pyramid. And so we need to work as concentric circles instead. And the pyramid is very much how we've thought about local government, and how certainly local government in Sweden has very efficiently worked. And it was also really interesting to hear how it wasn't the Twitter campaign part of things, which is what we all, I think, focused on in Sweden. That's what we saw of the Obama campaign, but this very traditional community organizing enabled by technology. So I was wondering, so many people here, maybe politicians, are already in power, or people running a process like a participatory budgeting process, and they don't have the benefit of being new and fresh and exciting. What do you think the lessons are for people who are already there, but perhaps do want to make those structural, be the person who is elected, but then changes the structure that got them there?
So, I mean, I'd say, I want to echo what some of the speakers this morning said. You can never start too early. And I think the way you start to plan a process is you bring very different kinds of people together. This goes back to Surowiecki's 4 indicators. If you're going to plan a process that is going to engage a lot of people in your town, you have to have people in your planning process that are diverse, right? That are coming from have artists and teachers and business leaders coming together. I think especially the creative side, the way that you design the posters for the campaign, what you have in the room, how you're attracting people to come to the room, the colors, the texture. I think this can be what makes your town different and what makes your process different. And so being creative, being diverse, and starting early, I think those would be my recommendations.
Fantastic. And you talked about the importance of crisis and how, the invasion of Persians or the Algerian crisis. What do you think our crisis is at the moment? Are there any particular, or is it too many to mention?
Well, there are a lot. I mean, I think that we have, I think that the crisis of populism is a multifold crisis. My Swedish friends who I've met today say, of course, the populist right here makes its electoral victories out of the issue of migration more than any other issue. But let me tell you, climate change is going to cause a lot more migration over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years. So unless we solve that problem of integration, building new stories at the local level, helping to make people feel included, it's not going to get any better. So I think that that's the crisis of a mobile, an increasingly mobile human society, I think is the major one we're confronting.
Yeah. And returning to social media, because if the story around Barack Obama's election was very much the social media election, all the exciting opportunities that social media did, the Trump election has almost turned it on its head, and there's a lot of worries about the effects of technology on democratic discourse. What's your sense? I mean, is technology having as big an effect as we think it is, or?
I think we exaggerate how much Facebook affected the 2016 election. And Twitter. Now, is it obvious that the Russians were trying to manipulate the election? To me, it's obvious. Is it obvious that Trump used Twitter more effectively than any candidate in history? Yes. But did that actually change the number of people who came out and vote? No. What changed the number of people who came out and vote were 2 things. Number one, the source of media, the number 1 source of media for American voters is not social media, it's television. And these older voters, the ones who had voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, because there were millions of them, right? They were watching Fox News. They were watching CNN, right? And it was the tweets that came on CNN. It was the rallies that were being given free advertising time for Trump. I think that had much more of an impact in raising Trump's profile than Facebook ads did. Not to undersell the importance of using social media responsibly, but I think that traditional media actually probably played as important a role as social media did.
Thank you. So I've certainly got a lot of thinking and to do over the mingle and the drinks in terms of how do we make local government into a community organizer and a facilitator. Thank you so much for that.
Pleasure.